everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. I'm Charles Max Wood. I'm kind of filling in for Nell, who usually kicks this thing off. And I'm here with Scott Nixon. Scott, do you want to say hi?
Hey, I'm Scott Nixon from Cloud Mechanics. Excited to be here today.
One of the things that I find that we talk a lot about at the different conferences and the different things that I'm working on is open source software. And a lot of people have a lot of ideas around open source software, but we don't often think about the people who are building it and trying to maintain it. And I had a friend, John, who came to me. He's been a guest on JavaScript Jabber a couple of times. He came and he actually said, "Hey, Chuck, I wish there was a show about sustaining open source." And that really hit me where I live. And I have a few other friends who are working on projects related to this. So we all got together and we put together a show called Sustain Our Software. You can find it at sustainoursoftwarepodcast.com. And it's a place where several people who are passionate about open source come together and have conversations about how it can be sustained and how it can be maintained and what we can do to help these maintainers continue to deliver us value that we build our software on. Most of the software we're building is based on open source. And so it's important to us to have that maintained and have it taken care of. Come check it out. It's been really interesting to listen to the conversations that they're having from people who are working in it all the time and just hear what they have to say about it. Once again, that's at sustainoursoftwarepodcast.com. Good deal. Before we get rolling, I'm a little curious, Scott. I just found out I'm going to be at both KubeCon and Microsoft Ignite. Are you going to make it to either of those?
No, I was looking at maybe going to Ignite, but now we've got some family stuff that's going to interrupt some of those, the ability for me to travel much this year. So.
Yeah, that happens. I totally get that. Yeah, in fact, one of the episodes that I'm doing at Microsoft Ignite and what kind of prompted the topic for today is that I submitted Ruby Rogues and I said I wanted to talk about containerizing a Ruby on Rails app. And so, of course, then I'm like, I don't freaking know how to containerize a Ruby on Rails app. So I thought we'd talk about it. And I've kind of gotten started. I think generally the principles are going to be the same for pretty much any app you're going to run on a Docker container. So I think there's going to be plenty to discuss here.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've done a lot of small Docker web deployments with Python and Django, and it works pretty great. So
yeah, I'm assuming that the principles are pretty much the same. You go and you pull an image that has in my case, I just pulled a Ruby image and then, told it to run a couple of commands in the Docker file and off I went, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, are you using Docker Compose to kind of configure all of this, or are you just using just a plain old Docker file?
So just to get started, I have just a Docker file. I think Docker Compose is something I'm hitting next just because there are a couple of different services to the app that I want to put up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to need more than one container to run all the stuff. Yeah.
So one of the things that's kind of a best practices I've kind of learned from one of the Docker captains is when you if you're going to have a bunch of Docker instances running, right, and you want them to talk to each other, the best way to do this is to basically put them all on their own network, right?
Right.
And you can obviously just, manually, do these with the scripts, right? Where you just say, hey, I want to create Docker network create, and then you just type the name or whatever. And then you can then attach them to each of the running Docker instances. But one of the things, if you use Docker Compose, Docker Compose by default will create a new network. And that's one of the advantages of it. And obviously you can specify all those multiple instances or different Docker containers that'll be running. And then obviously if you configure it, so they'll all be on the same network. And that just kind of makes that process a little easier, because it's less, obviously it's structured. And so it's really obvious to see what you're, what's in that Docker file, but it also includes things like the networking and storage and all that stuff. So.
Right. That makes sense. One thing that I'm wondering about with that is that if Docker Compose is going to set up a network and do all that kind of stuff, and then I wind up wanting to deploy this to a cloud somewhere, say Kubernetes or something like that, is my setup on my local system going to look all that different from, up in the cloud when I push it out there?
I mean, you still have to have the ingress, right? Because you still have to configure it, to set up those inbound ports. And so, I'm out of depth whenever it comes to talking about Kubernetes and stuff. So I can't really speak very clearly to that stuff, but it's, like when you set up that internal network, that is, or when Docker Compose sets up that network, you just should think of it like as an internal network, right? And it's not something that, is then publicly exposed, right? Because
it's locally addressable for the machines on the network.
Yeah, it's meant to where they can just communicate. Thinking a web front end, to have your Ruby app talking to a database or what do you call it, like a caching, like a Redis database, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, the example that I'm running through, it actually has you set up a machine for Postgres, a machine for Redis, which is kind of your caching layer. Ruby apps also tend to use the Redis layer for things like running jobs and stuff like that. And then you have your Rails app, which is also on another container. So it looks like I've only worked through about half of the first stage, which is getting my Rails app running on a container. And I do have a few questions about the process that they put me through there, but it looks like it's going to walk me through all of that stuff. So it'll be interesting to see where we get.
Are you planning to host this on GCP? Because you mentioned that. So.
I don't know. I'm going to be speaking at Ignite, so I'm kind of tempted to put it on Azure.
Yeah.
But I've been to Ignite and build. I mean, between the two conferences, I've been to probably 10 or 11 Microsoft events. They also used to do Microsoft Connect, and I'd wind up at that every year. Again, doing the kinds of podcast interview, press kinds of things. One thing that I've run into a little bit there is that they don't necessarily care if you use Azure. Like they want to promote it, but if I get one of their experts and we talk generally about Kubernetes, they're fine with that. Yeah. And so anyway, I don't know. I'm kind of playing with it. I've used DigitalOcean for a very long time. And they're not one of these like gigantic cloud things that are impossible to figure out for a normal guy like me. Yeah. And so I'm kind of tempted to throw something at them, but I don't know. I haven't decided exactly where it's going to land.
Yeah, it's really interesting that the DigitalOcean has become such like the fourth cloud option, and I haven't used it in a long time. Back in, oh God, I'm just going to say back in the day, because I don't remember. It was probably 2012 or before. They used to have like this special kind of service just for Django, and it kind of like went away. And I haven't used them since. So, but yeah, I've heard lots and they're really inexpensive and kind of easy to use. And they've really worked hard on their tutorials from the stuff I've seen. So,
yeah. So I'm playing with that. Also, if I can get this running, then I can probably move off of, I have kind of an auto deploy service that allows my, because I have another developer working on this particular app. And so it allows him to go in and push a button and have it deploy. And I don't have to give him credentials on the server or anything insane like that. So,
yeah. Are you using a good CI/CD, delivery mechanism?
I'm using Cloud 66.
Okay.
And they've sponsored Ruby Rogues, and I tried them out. I really like it. I mean, it's super easy to deal with. And so there's a lot going on there, but I'm kind of also now thinking about, okay, is there some easier way to orchestrate this if I'm on containers instead of on a virtual private server, so it's its own virtual machine, and just push it into a cluster and say, I need enough of these to handle handle the traffic, go, and then have it go, okay, we're starting to max out, and then have it spin up another container, and then when it's done, it just goes in and kills the container because there's nothing really perpetual on the container.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, if you're gonna is the idea is this app is just kind of like a single web instance, so you're not like running, multiple distributed failover type.
No, I'm not doing
stuff.
any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, if their Kubernetes cluster goes down, then so does my app, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, at the stage I'm at right now, I mean, we're getting ready to start beta testing it. And so it's mission critical for dev chat, but it's not, we're the only ones that would be affected if it went down.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got an internal app like that is actually becoming less and less relevant, but yeah, totally understand that.
One other thing that I'm wondering about though, and maybe you've got experience with this doing some of the, setup and deployment and stuff like that, is that the app currently uses PostgreSQL, and I've thought about actually switching over. I know DigitalOcean again has a like a hosted Postgres option.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I could just migrate the database into there. You can also on Amazon, I think they have a hosted Postgres option.
Yeah.
And instead of using a container to run the Postgres engine, because you can't put the data in there, right? Because if it kills the container, then you lose all that data. So
yeah. You want to use something. So in the, I don't know what DigitalOcean's version of this would be, but you want to use some kind of like persistent storage. I'm seeing something that says volume block storage and spaces object storage.
Yeah. The volumes. Or sometimes they actually work it out so it can run on their object store. But yeah.
I mean, ultimately, I think unless you're going to be running like an app that has lots and lots of data and lots of super optimization needed, I think you should always start and prefer managed databases, because it's just not a core competency. And and especially if you can get in something that's will auto scale and that manages backups and all this stuff. There's all these things that you need to be doing with databases where you're like, rotating logs and vacuuming the things. And there's just all this stuff that's going on that, there's no value in messing with that unless you're Netflix or somebody.
Yeah, I agree.
So
one other thing that I'm wondering about, while I'm asking all of my noob questions, and that is, so I started going through the tutorial, and, it has me start with a basic image, and then it tells me to run a copy command to pull my application. It copies my application over to the container, sets the work directory. I set an environment variable, and then I have a run command that basically installs Node.js because I need it. And then, installs the Rails dependencies and compiles my static assets, so CSS, JavaScript, and images. And then sets an entry point. And they told me to actually combine all of the shell commands into one command. And I didn't quite understand why I shouldn't just have like run this, run this, run this, run this.
I don't know if that's an optimization suggestion. So one of the things is, my understanding is that every time you have like a separate run command, it creates like a separate layer in there, and and that matters if you're going to save it. Yeah,
that's kind of what it implied.
Honestly,
is that each run command creates its own image.
Yeah, well, within a Docker thing, they have this concept of like a layer, because you're essentially starting off with you start off with kind of like the operating system at like a very low level, right?
Right.
And then you just add layers on top of it. And if you actually go to like hub.docker.com, you can like literally go in and look at each one and see all the different things it's doing. Right. And I don't have a proper, other than just to say there are layers, I don't have a better explanation than that. But like when you'll save like a Docker image, what you're doing is essentially saving those layers that have been added on and stuff like that. And I forget, there's some more nuances to this, but yeah.
Yeah, that was my understanding, is that it just saved you from creating those layers, which I guess when you save and push your final Docker image, it stacks all that stuff up and saves each intermediate image. And so
Yeah.
it essentially saves you, all of that time, effort, and space. But yeah, so I've got, run, and then it's got a bunch of and,
Yeah. Yeah.
which isn't that pretty, I'll just say. So
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of times, especially when you're doing anything that essentially looks like a shell script, it can be really, really ugly and hard to read because of just the nature of what the shell language looks like. And then plus every single kind of Linux tool, has its own, parameters and a million different things that just make it just explode with the amount of complexity that you're kind of like looking at. So
yeah, that makes sense. Back when we were starting up new shows, one of the shows that got started was Views on Vue. And one of the things that was really fun about that is that I got to know a bunch of really terrific people in the Vue community. And furthermore, one thing that happened that really hadn't happened on any of the other shows, we actually got a member of the core team to come on as a regular panelist on the show. We have Chris Fritz on there. The other thing is you may recognize some of the other voices. Ben Hong, who's on the official Vue News podcast, is also a panelist on the show. He's worked for Politico and now works for GitLab. We also have a bunch of other terrific panelists that come on and talk to you about what's going on in the Vue community. And because they're so closely tied to Vue and they talk to people about Vue all the time, they're very up to date and very knowledgeable about what's going on in the Vue community. So if you're looking for a way to learn Vue.js, or if you're looking for a way to stay current with Vue.js and kind of have the water cooler conversations you wish you could have about it in places where maybe they're not using it, then definitely check it out. You can find it at viewsonvue.com. And I'm also a little bit curious because, your Docker containers, like I don't want to put like API keys or anything into the Docker file.
Yeah.
That seems like a really terrible idea. So how do you manage secrets if, and you kind of mentioned that was a topic that you might talk about in a future episode, but how do you do that in Docker then? Because if I'm going to commit this and then I'm going to say, go run in the cloud. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so what you were making a reference to is that it's best, kind of a best case scenario, if you can use some kind of a secrets management platform where you, so AWS has, they have something called parameter store, and then they have also something called secrets management. And then, I think Azure has Vault, and then there's HashiCorp has this thing called Vault as well.
Okay.
And it's the idea is that you use, say, one credential that, or in the case, say with AWS and those in the cloud ones, you can have a role that talks to these, secrets management services, and then through code pulls down that information. And so that information is never written to any of the containers or the block storage or any of that stuff. And it's basically only unencrypted when it's in memory, but it's encrypted when you have it in Vault or in parameter store or secrets management. The way, a lot of the ways that you bootstrap in secrets within, say, like a Docker Compose file, is that you're just referencing like these local env files that they're not a part of your Git repository, but there's something that gets copied over as well. And you're copying that whole file over as well. So that's how you can manage it without these complex, I don't know if I should just call them like a secrets endpoint, basically like secrets endpoint API type thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've also seen like encrypted files, but then you still have to have the encryption key in your image somewhere to unencrypt them. So yeah. The Vault solutions sound like they make more sense.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much always have to have something that's giving, like bootstrapping the initial set of permissions. And when you have something in, say, an EC2, you can do that with a role, like that computer instance, that VM, whatever you want to call it, literally gets all of its permissions through the role, and then your code is able to then talk to those to these storage places to then load in all of these secrets into memory. So yeah. So when I've deployed both Django sites running in Docker Swarm or kind of single instance Docker containers, I've always I just run the application within that container. And because of the way I tend to manage assets, all my assets are always pushed to S3 and then distributed with CloudFront. I typically make a point not to ever have that Docker instance actually serving the static assets. It's literally just making that, it's just serving that HTML output that the application creates. And then I always use, managed databases. I've typically worked on smaller web-based applications that's very appropriate and usable. And, we're not like managing tons of data, having tons of scale. So it works really well. And I tend to use managed services for things like Redis caching, Worker. One of the other things I'll containerize are like Worker instances. So in the Django Python world, we use something called Celery as a job queue that will use Redis as like a database to store these jobs, but it's essentially the Celery Python application that's processing those jobs and managing all the access into the database and that kind of stuff.
Right.
So the talk that you're going to give is the idea that, it's kind of an introductory talk to containerizing a Rails app. And then, maybe you show one or more places that you can deploy this.
Yeah. I'm still working on some of that.
So. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny because you can, if you're using, kind of a regular CI/CD platform like Bitbucket, in my case, or, I don't know, Circle CI or, who's the other one that's really Netlify that's gotten really popular. You could literally have the same application to deploy to multiple different hosts, with your tutorial to kind of show people that, you can containerize this thing, but then it's fairly simple to just build a configuration for these new platforms. And then with these CI/CD tools, it kind of gets the application deployed for you. And it's it makes it a lot easier to conceptualize, and it shows you how like Docker is, what's the phrase everybody goes around where, portability. Yeah. That's what the word I was thinking of.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. On the front of the build and the CI/CD and all that stuff. It's, I hadn't even thought about that, but I like the idea of being able to set it up and then, I can run tests against the image and just, know that it's going to work. And, when I push it to production. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the wonderful things about these CI/CD platforms is that it allows you give them access to that service. You don't give them access to AWS or any of these places. All they're doing is getting the ability to contribute code and merge code and those types of things. They actually never get anywhere near the data or the actual hosted application.
Mm-hmm.
And and I suspect that this tool that you like so much, Cloud 66 and the Netlifys of the world, they're making it, just as absolutely dead simple as possible.
Yep. Yeah. We actually did a Ruby Rogues episode on Shiplane, which is a tool for managing and deploying Docker. And
Shiplane?
And it was interesting talking to him too, but I really dig the idea of, hey, it successfully built a Docker container. It successfully ran end-to-end tests against it, so let's push it live.
Yeah. Yeah. If tests are there to help you make sure that you can do that in such a way. And if you keep up with them enough, you don't have to go out and, deploy to some staging environment and then click around and try to make sure everything's working.
Yeah. In our case, essentially it would be to beta test new features if we had a staging environment. But even then I'm really in favor of feature flags for that kind of thing. And then just, set it up in production. turn it on for people who are interested in getting that stuff early. And then, just see where you end up.
Yeah.
Because they'll tell you it's not working, or they'll just not use it. And so if you see them use it once or twice and then not use it again, that's an indication that you can run on.
Yeah.
So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I've got this application, let's say a Django app. I mean, I really don't think the differences are big enough to worry about. And, they kind of want to use the Docker approach and put things out there. I mean, where do you start and where do you run to?
I think a lot of it, right? It's just like, I'm going to look a lot at what are they doing right now? Like, so, I mean, there's certainly a lot of applications out there that are just running an application. They don't have need for, they're not using caching. They're not doing any of that stuff. And so there's a lot of really simple ways, things like we had talked about that makes it really easy to get those deployed and put them in these Kubernetes clusters and whatnot. I think Elastic Beanstalk is actually it looks like one of these simple services, but it at the underneath level, it essentially is configuring and deploying the application within Docker. Now you don't have to create like a Docker file or anything like that to get it deployed. You're literally able to kind of just like WYSIWYG configure it. I think, the advantages of using Docker ultimately are that you're going to use this as something that allows you to scale and to maybe not have as many resources. Maybe you're running 5 EC2 instances, but you're running multiple applications across these different EC2 instances because you're running them like a true Docker cluster. And so there's, maybe they're in a swarm. And so then you have services and you are able to, you let the management software decide where it's going to put these instances based off of load and memory usage and all these types of things. And so I think, that's where you really see the benefits, because you could essentially not have, you could be deploying both your staging, dev, test, and production all within this same set of 5 EC2 instances, but you're doing them to different services, maybe different swarm clusters, those types of things. And, I think, that's one of the ways that you can have a lot of this flexibility, maybe limit the amount of money you're spending. Because imagine so I said 5 instances. Now if you had test, staging, and production, and you wanted your test and staging to replicate production, and in production you have two web instances talking to maybe a managed database. So you need this. So now all of a sudden that's 6 EC2 instances that you would need if you were trying to replicate it. And so, right there, a lot of this is about managing, how many instances are you managing, how much stuff is running. And so if you're letting this, like I said, the management software decide how to scale it and manage those things, then I think, and because then you can also build that to where it will add new instances dynamically. If it realizes that you're getting a lot of load, because maybe it's Black Friday and, it'll start scaling out the number of EC2 instances you have, and you maybe don't notice it because the system is kind of growing and shrinking as needed. So, I mean, one of the things is there's always you have these instances that are just massively underutilized. You'll have things that are running 1% and 2%. That's one of the most funny things I'll see is somebody shows up with this server they're paying $600 a month for, and it's utilized 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
And they have this $600 a month instance because when they have these unknown big events, they want to be able to handle the load, but they don't have, they haven't done the work of configuring auto scaling groups and,
Yeah.
you have to configure metrics to monitor. You have to figure out what are the things, processing power, RAM, like at what trigger points do we scale up and start adding new instances? Because I've had customers go from $600 a month instances to like $40 a month, with 2 different instances. So you had some failover across availability zones and stuff like that. And now they have the ability to scale up when they have these big instances. So.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, I think one of the if you're just trying to find your way and trying to understand the value of Docker, I mean, you can really just start off with using Docker in a development environment, getting comfortable there. And then, my next step would be to maybe you start, because my philosophy is every single developer. So if you get 10 developers, every single developer should be able to have their own private test environment where they can deploy code to. They can just destroy anything in that environment,
right,
and it doesn't affect anybody else. And so I think, having a development cluster just for Docker or Kubernetes or whatever you like want to use, I think that's a good way to kind of get going. And obviously you'll learn a lot in that process. The problem you ultimately have is if you're doing Docker and test and those types of things, and you're not doing it in production, now you have more complexity for the developer to manage or think about. And, hopefully it doesn't cause any problems, but you just never know.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess the other thing, I'm more on the dev side on this than the ops side. Do people generally run their tests in a Docker container, or do they just do that the way I've always done it and just, run it locally on my machine?
Yeah. I mean, you definitely can run tests by, initiate, because so you can, it's kind of funny because yes, you can, once you've like say deployed an application to run within like a container, right? Mm-hmm. The only thing you can do is start new instances that's based off that same image,
right?
To then and run like management commands, because essentially running tests in that fashion, because it has the feature, like the characteristics of a management command, because it's something that starts and ends, right? As opposed to an application that's meant to stay on all the time. So
right.
Yeah, you definitely can run tests within those containers. And honestly, I would be surprised if every CI/CD software out there isn't using containers. I'm mostly certain that that's how most of them work right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And essentially you just set that entry point to, whatever you use to run the tests as opposed to whatever you use to start your server, your web server or whatever.
And whenever when you're configuring something like Bitbucket, for example, that's the one I use the most. And so that's the one why I'm referencing it. But one of the things that you do is configure at the top of the file is you're essentially giving it, you're giving a name, which is a reference to basically a Docker image. So the same when you go to hub.docker and you look up, say, Rails, there's all these different versions of, say, Ruby Alpine version, whatever. And, that's essentially what you're putting in the CI/CD configuration files as well. I mean, I think running tests locally is a development concern, right? And you want to run tests before you deploy it. But the reality is that the CI/CD stuff is meant to be, if you configure it in the proper way, where maybe you're working out of you're working out of maybe your own branch, right? You're not working in master, because master is maybe what you send to production, but you're working out of some like branch that lives for like a day or a week, and that branch is configured so that it does a full like normal build process. So it runs through your tests, it deploys to some, like I said, an individual developers, set of servers, so to speak. And so my feeling is that that's how you run your tests mostly. Like you're developing, you're like running them locally because you're developing them. And then as soon as they pass and you're happy with stuff, you commit your code, and then you push to Git or Bitbucket. And then that thing triggers the process of running your tests and building and really validating what you've done in an environment that is not just your machine.
The thing that I believe most about top-notch developers is that they're constantly learning. Whether you're out watching videos, whether you're reading blog posts or books, whether you're out writing open source software, you're always out there learning how to be a better developer. And my friends at Thinkster and I teamed up and we put together a show called the Dev Ed Podcast. You can find it at devedpodcast.com. It's run by Joe Eames, who you might know from JavaScript Jabber, Adventures in Angular, and Views on Vue. And they have terrific conversations about what it means to become a better developer, to learn how to do development, and the ways that you can learn. So if you're looking for inspiration and ideas about how you can do better and learn better as a developer, then go check out the Dev Ed Podcast.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the only thing that I see is that one of the things that really, I guess, I really like about Docker is that I can run the same environment here as I can in the cloud.
Yeah.
And so if I'm going to run my tests, running them in a Docker container that looks exactly like the Docker container I'm going to deploy means that all of the dependencies are the same, all of the underlying infrastructure is the same. And I don't have to worry about what those differences are going to be because they're going to be basically the same.
Yeah.
Now, generally, like with Rails, it doesn't really matter unless you just have a really, really old version of Ruby. But, I could see that as a concern depending on what you're running.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, you're totally right. I mean, you can definitely make it to where when you're running your tests locally, you're running them within like Docker, running these management commands where it's essentially running those tests and replicating what would essentially happen within a CI/CD. What happens is that you go up, configuring all of this stuff locally is a level of complexity that is a little harder to you have to really have learned a lot about Docker to just be able to get to that point to where you can do those types of things. And so, I mean, it's all definitely good stuff.
Yep, absolutely. Are there any questions that I didn't ask that I probably should have been thinking about?
I mean, obviously, I think what's the preferred or what's considered one of the better, like reverse proxies to push your Rails app through? Are you guys
usually Nginx?
Nginx, yeah. I mean, I think the big thing is you have to make sure that if you're going to push something to production, that you've spent some time understanding that your Nginx configuration is appropriate and proper. Because
Right.
obviously, because there's Docker images have good defaults, so to speak, right? However, there's, and part of it is I'm out of my scope with Rails stuff, but I'm just trying to think through some of the, it's just, you want to make sure that you're not going to, expose yourself in some weird way. And I mean, I think that's always going to be a problem when you're managing all of the software that's used to serve your application, as opposed to using, a cluster like you were talking about, like these GCP or whoever cluster. I'm trying to think what else would.
Yeah, I guess that's another point in favor of, it's the GCPs or Azures or whatever, is that I can containerize my app. I don't have to worry about configuration for Kubernetes or anything like that, because essentially I can build my image, or I think image is the right term, but I can build my image and then I can essentially say, I can hand it off to Azure or GCP or Amazon, and then they'll set up all the rest of it so that it reverse proxies properly and scales properly, and load balances properly, and all of that other stuff. And so essentially I just said, this is what you need to run the app. And then they go and they run the app at whatever scale I need. Yeah.
And I mean, one of the things is I don't know how DigitalOcean is configured, but what I'm thinking through is like, there's things like, is there some kind of web application firewall? I don't know if they do. By default, AWS does some default kind of security filtering. It's very high level, but obviously there's things like Cloudflare that can help out with some of those things. But I mean, I wouldn't say it's always the best idea to just expose, Nginx with your application on the internets without a lot of, there's just so many vectors and ways that, things can be exploited, even if you think you're on the latest everything, there's just a lot there, and it would, it would be better to delegate some of that responsibility to people who have to something that is a little smarter security wise than, just Nginx.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it makes sense.
That's always, that is definitely a big concern for any time I'm going to deploy something, is like, making sure that, the way we've configured it, that things are isolated in a way, and that we're, we're protecting data, and we're making sure that, one of the, it's become like kind of a joke that, people will mention that, or find out that somebody had left some S3 folders wide open. And so people were able to just copy all this customer's data down. And, and so if anything, spend more time thinking about how you're securing your customer data. Those types of things, I think, would be really, these are always important. I just think that it can be overlooked with when you start touching all these tools that are kind of new and stuff. So,
yep. Makes sense. Well, cool. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks and wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to start? Do you have some things you want to shout out about?
Oh, it was funny because I didn't write anything down ahead of time. So I'm going to need to go look around and see what have I been looking at lately that I like a lot. So
that's fine. I can throw mine out real quick. So I've been rearranging my office. It's in a perpetual state of being rearranged, actually. And mostly it's because I decided I wanted to do video shows, and I wanted to put together some stuff with doing green screens and things like that. And so I've got video equipment, so now I got to move everything around and put the green screen at one end of my room so that I can make it work, or my home office. So one of the things that I ran across was that my desk it wasn't working for me, the way that it was set up. And basically what I wanted to do was I wanted to raise the monitors that I had.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that when you go looking for longer poles for your monitor arms, they don't really sell them. I couldn't find them anywhere. And I thought about, okay, well, what if I did this? What if I did that? And then I found these brackets. They're on Amazon, and they're like $10. And what they are is they kind of have kind of a ratcheting slider on it. And so you attach the one end to the back of the monitor, you attach the bracket to the monitor arm, and then you can move the monitor up and down, and it'll stay where it is, stay where you leave it. And so I was able to raise my monitors. They were probably 3 inches, maybe 2 or 3 inches off my desk, and I was able to raise them another 4 or 5 inches. And it just opened up a whole bunch of room on my desk because it's not behind the monitor anymore. The downside was that it exposed the cords that are hanging off the back of the monitor. And so I got Amazon had another deal, and it was like $10, I think. I don't remember for sure. So if I link to it and then you're like, oh, that's not, it costs more than that, I'm sorry. But they had 100 Velcro strips for cord management, which is way more than I need, but dang, super convenient.
Yeah.
And so I picked those up as well. So my desk management has gotten a little bit better, and I'll probably wind up rearranging the rest of my room this week. So yeah, those are my picks. And then, if you want to connect over Ignite or KubeCon, I'm probably going to set up some meetups. So if you go to devchat.tv and then click on the events tab, it should take you to a place where I'll have that set up when I know when and where I'm going to be, that, I can meet up with listeners. So
cool. Very cool. So I'm going to give 2 closely related suggestions. So I'm 41 years old now, and it's funny, in the last 5 years, I've gotten way more into cars for some reason. And I actually have a Tesla right now. And I love that. But I think getting more into cars in general and getting more into my Tesla has made me appreciate other things as well. And so if you're a Prime user, you can watch the Grand Tour, which is the guys who did, it was like this famous, it's Richard Hammond, Jeremy Clark, and James May, who did like this famous race car show, or just, car show in general in the UK, and that they brought to the US, and Amazon. They've done 3 seasons of it. And I just laugh myself silly watching it. I wasn't really a big fan of the old show that they had done, or I hadn't watched much of it, but this, the 3 seasons, I just am like crying laughing sometimes. They're just so ridiculous. They just do insane stuff. Like for example, like I think it was the second season, they do these like car challenges where they try to like modify their car, do something weird to it, and then they kind of like race over like say like 1,000 miles to get from point A to point B, and whoever gets there wins. And for there's like no prize or whatever. It's just pure, hey, I won. And one of the guys he like tried to like use mud, like clay bricks that they were actually like, so they weren't even actually like cooked bricks. It was just like clay cut into brick form or whatever. And he like, it's just so ridiculous that he like built a car like that. So, but I just think the show's hilarious. I think anybody should check it out. The Grand Tour on Amazon. The other one is also an Amazon recommendation. And it's Gymkhana, which is, so there's this guy, a rally racer, Ken Block, who's been doing these. And I guess this is like the 10th. It's kind of like the Gymkhana Files is the one I'm watching, which is kind of like a behind the scenes of him making this next Gymkhana like movie or whatever. And he just does these crazy things with all these different cars. Like he's doing like donuts, and there's a guy riding a Segway in the middle as he's like going around in a circle, and just crazy little stuff like that. And I just think it's a lot of fun to watch. So
cool.
That's it for picks for me, man.
Good deal.
Awesome. Well, I think we're booked up with a lot of guests for the next, month or so. So it should be good. A lot of interesting folks coming on.
Yeah, I'm excited.
All right. Well, thank you very much, man. It's great chat with you today.
Yeah, you too.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.